Welcome, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to hear our summary and report on Power Trends 2023. Power Trends is our flagship publication about the state of the grid within New York State. We're very proud to share our findings and our key facts with you this morning. Some of the key themes, just jumping right in, the key themes that we see and many of you are aware of is really centered around the rapid change that we are seeing in the electric system, largely driven by public policies and impacting not only how energy is produced, but also how it's transmitted and consumed. When we look at the reliability of the power system, we focus primarily on the reliability margins that we see and how those margins are shrinking. Some of that has to do with the retirement of historic supply, but also new demand that's coming in the system, largely driven by economic development, but also electrification. We keep a tight focus on the forecast for both of these, and a lot of our presumptions, studies, analysis, and recommendations on the power grid are based on our analysis of that rapidly changing dynamics of the system. Also driven by public policies, we see that there's significant new resources interconnecting to the grid, really at record levels. And that is not just supply, but also load and transmission. So the power grid itself is undergoing a historic change, leading to complexity of operation of the grid, and also the need to keep tight focus on that balance of supply and demand. One of the things that we're also cognizant of, and we're trying to highlight awareness of, is the additional new technologies that are going to be required when we start thinking about the longer range goals of the CLCPA, those emission-free resources that are going to be necessary to balance the intermittency of wind and solar are not yet available on a commercial scale. So we continue to highlight the need for research and development in those areas, and that's going to be increasingly important as the transition of the grid takes place. We also highlight some of the changes that we have with respect to our wholesale energy market roles. We view our energy market as a vital component to ensure that we've got the right types of resources to meet the reliability criteria, but also do so at a cost that is most efficient for consumers. So through the course of the next several years, we've got a fairly structured and robust portfolio of new market enhancements to recognize the pricing signals that are going to be necessary to attract the right kind of resources to the right locations on the grid. And we're pretty happy with our plan associated with that. Those are the key themes that we have in our Power Trends report. I'm going to turn it over to Emily Nelson now, that's going to hit some of the data and statistics on the state of the grid. And then I'll wrap it back up, and then we'll be happy to take questions at the end. Emily?
Thank you, Rich. So this graph shows the actual energy use in 2022, along with the forecasted energy use over the next 30 years. The baseline forecast in dark blue at the bottom of the graph represents the most likely energy use based on current observations and assumptions. There are also two policy scenarios that are represented, a lower and high demand policy scenario. These represent some of the different paths to achieve full compliance with the state policy. There are a few differences between the policy scenarios, such as including the types of technologies adopted for compliance, as well as the adoption of peak producing or demand side measures. And if we move to the next graph, a longstanding part of Power Trends, we like to note that the NYISO markets provide signals to encourage generation to operate more efficiently. And this is an important part of supporting the public policy goals to reduce emissions. It is noteworthy that there's an uptick in carbon dioxide emissions since 2022. This is attributable in part to the deactivation of Indian Point. This is a point I will cover in some more detail in future slides. We certainly see that electrification will lead to an increase in overall demand. The load shapes for high demand days are also expected to shift in the future. The solid lines you see on the bottom of this graph represent last winter in dark blue and last summer in dark green. You can see that the hourly demands projected 30 years into the future are also represented by dashed lines at the top of the graph. We see that with the introduction of more solar, the system will change to winter peaking. This is an important change that we're preparing for, and I'd like to describe that in some more detail in the upcoming slides. As I mentioned, long-term forecasts predict that New York will be a winter peaking state in and about 2034. There are a few factors driving this shift from a summer to a winter peaking system. Electrification of buildings with the installation of heat pumps is a key factor. Additionally, the electrification of vehicles and the rate of adoption will be impactful to the timing. In many ways, the stakes will be higher with respect to having a reliable electric grid. We see that a greater dependence on the grid to support the broader economy and society through their heating and transportation needs certainly is top of mind as we prepare for the changes coming in the future. Rather than provide a long-term view, this graph shows a typical trend for a particular day. And we'd like to cover a little bit more information on our efforts to integrate behind the meter solar. Solar resources help meet demand from the grid during the day, of course. They also push the peak demand hours out later to the evening. With more than 4,200 megawatts of behind the meter solar installed at the end of 2022, we see these impacts today. Through NYISO forecasting tools, we estimate and track solar production. And as you can see in the graph, there is significantly greater contribution from solar during summer months as compared to the winter. When the system transitions to a winter peaking system in the future, the value of solar resources to meet peak demand will require complementary technologies such as storage in order to provide reliability value. New York is working toward 10,000 megawatts of solar by 2030. The next graph digs a little bit deeper into wind energy and specifically curtailment. There are transmission system limitations driving congestion on the power grid, and these factors can result in curtailment of wind production. We look forward to the investment in transmission that is currently underway, along with the renewable build-out that's underway to alleviate congestion over the long term. Additionally, it's noteworthy that much of the wind on the system, in fact, all of the wind on the system today is land-based. And to the extent the offshore grid is built out in the coming years, the offshore wind will be located closer to the New York City metropolitan area, the load center in New York, and it's an important part of the future grid. We often spend quite a bit of time in power trends on the capacity and the energy production graphs. Here you see the generating capacity by fuel source in 2023. Many of you are familiar with this, but I'll just note that capacity represents the maximum electric output by the generation fleet in New York. If you look at the graph on the left, you'll see that statewide, New York has a relatively diverse mix of generation resources represented by the different colors. There are stark differences when we look at upstate New York, represented on the top right, relative to downstate. Downstate continues to be heavily reliant on gas-fired and dual-fuel generation capacity to meet the demand. And of course, upstate generation still has a capacity mix that has many zero-emission resources, including hydro, wind, and nuclear capacity. In addition to looking at capacity, it's important to note energy production. And this is a compilation of data from last year, 2022. Fossil fuel-fired generation accounts for 70% of New York's generation capacity, but only about 51% of its energy production. I promised to cover nuclear in a little bit more detail. I'd like to do so now. Nuclear resources account for 9% of generating capacity, but contribute approximately 21% of the total energy produced. With the closure of Indian Point, nuclear production has declined statewide over time from 33% of the overall fuel mix in 2019 to 24% in 2021, and as represented in the graph here, 21% in 2022. Looking to the future, expanded transmission capabilities, such as underway with the public policy transmission projects, will enable more upstate clean energy to flow into the downstate region, potentially displacing some of that fossil fuel production. And the build out of more solar, wind, and storage in the coming years will meet more of New York's energy needs. With that, I'd like to turn it back to Rich Dewey to continue with the slides.
Thank you, Emily. Just to circle back on one of our key themes and really reinforce the point, one of the things which we are mindful of at the New York ISO as we study the future operation of the system is the shrinking supply margin that we see on the grid. New York State has enjoyed a surplus of energy supply over the last few decades. That surplus allows us to manage the grid through contingencies and severe weather events. And as that supply margin shrinks, it just makes it more complicated and tighter operationally to make sure that we can maintain reliability. Given the fact that the number of deactivations has outpaced the number of new additions, that balance is coming into sharp focus as we look forward to the future. So we are very mindful of assessing and evaluating planned deactivations and ensuring that we can maintain that tight balance that's necessary to operate the power grid. And we're going to continue to keep sharp focus on that. Additionally, I referenced earlier that we're mindful that the number of interconnection requests has quadrupled. That's something that is a high priority for us at the New York ISO. We're doing everything that we can to make sure that process is as efficient and effective as possible in making sure that those new resources can interconnect to the power grid reliably and safely. And we continue to work closely with our market participants to make sure that that process is smooth. We talked a little bit about transmission. We've been very bullish on transmission at the New York ISO in past versions of Power Trends, highlighting how important the development of transmission infrastructure is to the achievement of the public policies. We're very, very happy with the progress that has been made over the last several years, not only the efforts that the New York ISO has spearheaded in cooperation with the New York State Public Service Commission, but also in recognition that some of the projects that the New York Power Authority has undertaken, specifically the Smart Path projects in the northern part of the state, as well as efforts underway as driven by NYSERDA's Tier 4 REC program to drive the development of new transmission, the Champlain Hudson Express from Canada into New York City, and also the Clean Path New York project, which is under development right now. We continue to advocate for the development of new transmission. That infrastructure development is going to be so vitally important to make sure that these clean energy resources, which are typically located far away from where the load centers are, that power can be moved into the load centers, ultimately will be critical to achievement of the goals. Thinking about the New York ISO's comprehensive system planning process, this is something that is vital to ensure that as the grid changes and the enhancements that are proposed, again, are interconnected and targeted both in the right locations and coordinated at the right time with the right balance. The system of studies that are undertaken regularly are important and necessary, not only to make sure that we're communicating, selecting the right projects, but also communicating the right data to policymakers and stakeholders. And these studies are increasingly sources of very valuable information that contributes both to Power Trends and the studies themselves. When I think about what the rest of the year entails, I want to point out a couple of key milestones that are coming up, just to put them on your radar. In July, the short-term assessment of reliability, which is one of the important components of the New York ISO's comprehensive system planning process. The STAR report for July will assess the reliability of the summer of 2025, which is the next compliance date for peaker plant compliance with DEC emissions rules. So we're looking very closely at that. We're anticipating that we could have reliability criteria violations in that report that we're going to have to manage. And that report is coming out in July. Also, sometime this summer, shortly, the Long Island Public Policy Transmission selection is likely to be made. The New York ISO staff did make a recommendation, which is now going to move on to the NYISO board. So we anticipate an award for that project, which is necessary to both strengthen the ties between Long Island and New York City, but also enable the delivery of a lot more offshore wind that interconnects onto Long Island. And then later in the year, our comprehensive reliability plan is the next instance where we do that 10-year lookout as we start thinking about the dramatic electrification and the demands, challenges we expect to see with that, as well as the schedule and timeline for the new supply and new transmission. And then, of course, throughout the year, we're going to continue to work with stakeholders to make sure that we sharpen the pricing signals through enhancements to our market software, to make sure that that we can attract and retain the right kind of resources, and then use that market mechanism as the vehicle really to make sure that we've got the right kind of assets to maintain reliability. So that's what we got coming up for the year. And as always, New York ISO's mission is to ensure power system reliability in competitive markets. This is something that every member of our team thinks about each and every day, and I'm pretty proud of the work that we do to help New York City achieve this monumental clean energy transition, and do so in the most reliable manner possible.
That concludes our Power Trends 2023 briefing. You can view the complete Power Trends report and additional materials by going to NYISO.com/power-trends. We thank you again and look forward to talking to you soon.